I wish that 2021 was slightly different to how we were in 2020 when we kicked off this this series, but alas, we are still all online and we are all making the absolute very best of it. So that was part of our thinking behind getting this series going, was what can we offer our students that will be different, because the whole world is different now. We're not able to meet in person, etc. And so Alex and I were thinking about what we could do, and we came up with this series on a series of topics that Oxford minds, and that draws together Oxford's minds, our great minds and our great thinkers, to be able to bring them to you. Last term we had race, sustainability, justice, protection. This term we have power, space, identity and belonging. And I think the lineup for this Hillary term promises to be as good, if not better, than Michaelmas term. Just a reminder, if you wanted to catch up on any of the lectures or panel discussions that we had last term, they are available on the Social Sciences YouTube channel. Tricky to say quickly. And I hope you will see that. I'm going to hand over to Alex, who is going to introduce our very esteemed speaker for tonight, which I am hugely looking forward to. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Susan. This term, we're focusing on the key concepts in the social sciences, the things that unify across disciplines. And we're focusing, as Susan said, on power, space, identity, and belonging. And in kicking off the term with the question of how we can think about power, there are very few people in the world who are better placed to think about and reflect on this topic than Professor Saskia Sassen. Saskia is the Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. And she's worked for decades on the question of how power operates in the global economy and its effects on marginalized people. That work has been pioneering in thinking about themes such as transnationalism, networks, globalization, and indeed the role of technology in shaping and reconfiguring our world. And a key focal point of that research has been the global city, a term that Saskia herself coined. She's thought about the way in which power in the global economy operate through capitalism, through war and conflict, and their effects on populations such as refugees, migrants, and precarious labor. She's held academic positions at Harvard, Chicago, LSE, amongst others. And her great works include The Global City, published by Princeton University Press in 2001. More recently, Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, published by Belknap Press in 2014. And only last year, with Mary Kaldor at the LSE, she published Cities at War, Global Insecurity and Urban Resistance with Columbia University Press. Saskia, we're absolutely thrilled that you've joined us, and we'll hand over the floor entirely to you for the next 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And if at home while you're listening, you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can following Saskia's talk. Saskia, all yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very, very generous introduction. And I'm really looking forward to doing this. Let me start by sort of emphasizing a particular, as I like to call it, filière, particular kind of thread that I want to pull you into and take you through diverse elements. So the generic title, if you want, of what I'm talking about is what matters in the global economy today. And one element that seems important to me is that what matters are the specialized differences of cities, not the generic, not what they all share. It is precisely the differences among cities. Just think New York and Chicago and the West Coast in the United States. Do that also for Europe. And you can see that each major city has a deep history, its own, and it was shaped that way. And they may have tried to change it and to make it look a bit more like London, a bit more like New York. It didn't work because there are deep histories involved. It has also to do with the materialities, of course, of cities. Now, so what I want to focus on a bit is this issue of those specialized differences of cities. And so one way of starting is to think about the enormous variety of global circuits that connect cities. Most of our major cities are connected with a vast number of other cities. Now, some of these global circuits are specialized, but some are not at all. Some are worldwide, others are regional. Different circuits contain different groups of countries and cities, and they create their own sort of often very transnational geographies. They're partial, but they're powerful. So one way of thinking about it then is that the global is constituted at multiple scales, many different scales. And major cities have become one scale. And you might say that even among cities, you have quite a differentiation. Now, I have looked really at cities across the world. And so I just want to share a few elements here with you. So if you take a city like Mumbai, so Mumbai is today on a global circuit, and I'm just focusing on very specific elements. So in this case, it's a circuit for commercial real estate development, rather than everything. So if you take that Mumbai case, so Mumbai today on a global circuit for commercial real estate developments and investments, that includes firms from cities as diverse as London and Bogota. And you can add, of course, a whole number of others. If you take something like global commodity in coffee trading, it includes New York, which doesn't have a bean of coffee, in its, certainly not in New York. I mean, we drink it, but not the actual element. So global commodity trading in coffee includes cities like New York, which really don't, they don't have a serious thing about that, and Sao Paulo as major hubs. Global commodity trading in, say, sunflower seeds includes Buenos Aires, Chicago, and Mumbai. Gold, that includes Sao Paulo, Joburg, Sydney, Dubai, Mumbai, New York, London, Zurich, and more. So you get a sense of particularities and specificities. This variability adds to the flexibility of urban economies. It is critical for a large city to use its scale for diversifying its economy. Different scales enable the development of a diversity of economies. Otherwise, it would be like a plantation economy. That is what a city like Detroit was reduced to when all it produced, albeit a complex element, was cars. And cars, the fact that it was only cars, brought Detroit down. Even though a car is a very complex element of different types of knowledge, but in the end it winds up being one type of product for sale on the markets. And you can really go through a whole series of these. Now, if you look at sort of other elements that are not the economy, etc., culture, politics, migrations, and many other such things also feed this proliferation of circuits. Take, for example, NGOs fighting for rainforests. They function in circuits that include Brazil and Indonesia, the global media centers of New York and London, and the major forestry companies and the headquarters of sellers, such as Oslo, London, and Tokyo. The other side of all of these trends is an increasing urbanizing of global networks. So a given city may be located on dozens of global circuits. Look at it from the perspective of a given city makes it clear that the diversity and specificity of its location on some or many of these circuits is what you really need to understand if you want to know what you can do in this or that city. These emergent intercity geographies begin to function as an infrastructure for multiple forms of globalization. And again, I repeat, they begin to function as an infrastructure for multiple forms of globalization. The first step is to identify the specific global circuits on which a city is located. And cities have many, many circuits on which they are located. A given city has many circuits. Each of these circuits has also specific cities. The groupings of cities vary on each circuit. All of this also shows us that the specialized differences of cities matter, and that there is less competition among cities and more of a global or regional division of functions than is commonly recognized. Specialized differences of cities, let me elaborate a bit of that. Take the knowledge economies of Sao Paulo, Chicago, and Shanghai. They're very different, but they also share certain aspects. These three very different cities all share a long history of servicing major heavy manufacturing sectors, so heavy manufacturing. Their economic histories are very different from New York, London, or Rio de Janeiro. Out of these types of specialized differences comes a global division of functions. Thus, a steel factory, a mining firm, or a machine manufacturer that wants to go global, Paulo to Shanghai, Chicago, for its legal accounting, financial insurance, economic forecasting, and other such specialized services. It will not go to New York, London, or Rio for this highly particular servicing. Where we can ask the question, where does a city's knowledge economy actually come from? Because cities have really distinctive knowledge economies. So recognizing the value of the specialized differences of cities and urban regions in today's global economy shows how the economic history of a place matters for the type of knowledge economy that a city or a city region ends up actually developing. This goes against the common view that globalization homogenizes economies, that it partly depends on the particularities of a city's or a region's economy is far more important than this notion of homogenizing that economy. Now, how much this economic history, these specialized histories of these cities varies and partly depends on the particulars of a city's or a region's economy. It matters more, this is the important point, than is commonly assumed. And it matters in ways that are not generally recognized. So one question that we can ask at this point is, globalization, what does it actually homogenize? What does it make sort of the same across our planet? So globalization homogenizes standards for managing, for accounting, for manufacturing, for all kinds of things. And that is a very, very important element. It also homogenizes standards for building states, state-of-the-art office districts and luxury hotels, state-of-the-art airports, and so on. The spread of these standards creates a sense of homogeneity, even though such standards do not exclude very original architecture. Such built environments are a kind of novel infrastructure. We really need to think of them as infrastructures. They are necessary, but indeterminate. They can be used in many different ways, and that is what makes them different. But the global economy needs really diverse, specialized capacities. Does the indeterminacy of these built environments allow for sharp differences in the specialized modalities of each of those economies? state-of-the-art office districts are very similar, even when the types of business they handle can be radically different, especially if we take into account highly specialized differences. Now, I wanted to show you some visual examples of these differences, of leading major cities, but clearly without that, regrettably, we cannot show that now. So let me just go back to this notion of that the specialized differences of cities feed also the growth of global cities. If these cities were all the same, it just would be different, but they are not. Each one has strengths and weaknesses. And so different firms will, prefer one or the other. It depends on what they are involved in. Each of the 70 plus major or minor global cities in the world today contributes to the production of these capabilities in its home country, and thereby functions as a bridge between its national economy and the global economy. In this networked multi-city geography, most of the 250,000 plus multinational corporations, now multinational corporations are very big corporations, they're not necessarily the little firms that can also be very powerful, but if you just look at that, the multinational corporations in the world have kept their headquarters in their home countries. They may have secondary headquarters, but the main headquarters are still in their countries. No matter the vast numbers of affiliates, subsidiaries, or offshore sourcing sites they may have around the globe. Now, there is no perfect global city. It doesn't exist. There is no perfect city, whether global or not global. When firms go global, they tend to locate operations in multiple cities that function as entry points into national economies. This bridging capacity is critical. The multiple circuits connecting major and minor global cities are the live infrastructure of the global economy. I want to say that again. The multiple circuits connecting major and minor global cities are the live infrastructure. It is all those circuits that keep connecting. They're really the infrastructure, the live infrastructure of the global economy. It indicates, again, that cities do not simply compete with each other. It is not, that is not correct. I mean, there might be some competitions, but mostly not. A global firm does not want one global city, even if it is the best in the world. It wants different groups of cities that will be far more desirable to different types of firms, even if some of these cities may have some serious negatives. This helps explain why there is no one perfect global city. Today's global phase does not function through one imperial global capital that has it all, as we may have had, in the past. None of the leading cities in the world ranks at the top in everything. They have done all kinds, of examinations of this. There is long lists. So this is one very good one that I often cite, a large study of 75 cities rates the top cities for worldwide commerce, but not one of them ranks at the top, not one of those cities ranks at the top in all of the 100 factors. And not one gets the perfect score of 100. That is also to be noticed. London and New York, the two leading global cities, rank low in several aspects. Neither is in the top 10 when it comes to starting a business or closing a business. If we consider a critical variable in the ease of doing business, so as an indicator, part of which is ease of entry and exit, London ranks 43rd and New York 56. London ranks 37th on contract enforcement and 21st on investor protection. Now, we tend to think that a city like London, like New York, they're absolutely perfect. They are not. They still are very important, very powerful, and very desirable. But it is Singapore that ranks number one in relation to all three those variables. So that is also quite remarkable. In the global south, cities like Mumbai and Sao Paulo are in the top group for financial and economic services, but they are brought down in their overall score by their low rankings in factors related to the ease of doing business, to livability, given their especially low levels of well-being for vast sectors of the population. Now, whether all of this stuff is good or bad for the larger social fabric of these cities and their countries is a complex matter and the subject of many debates. The fact that global firms need cities and groups of cities should enable the political, corporate, and civic leadership in those cities to negotiate for more benefits for their cities from global firms. This could lead to overall positive outcomes if the governing classes can see that these global economic functions will grow better in a context of a strong and prosperous middle class, rather than the sharp inequality and polarity that exists among a growing share of households, especially in these major cities. European global cities in that sense have done much better than global cities in the United States, and precisely for this reason. Now, I want to begin to conclude and want to sort of wrap up this notion of the global city. So in its tightest formulation, it is an extreme intermediation function. It requires a state-of-the-art operational space that can handle the needs of firms that go global and that cannot do it all in-house. It includes the households of high-level employees, but also the households of their cleaners. But in that context, those cleaners actually become strategic workers because they're dealing with, a very high level, important, whatever, powerful man or woman at the top of a firm. There is no such entity as a single global city. It is a multi-sided, networked system of global cities. I just want to, these are just elements that are separate. Right? It's not that one connects to the other, but these are four features. And one key feature that they all share, though in different ways, is the rise of extractive logics. In other words, these are becoming economies that we can think of as not just producing and selling. Yes, they produce and they sell, and they increasingly grab power. They become more and more powerful. And that is, of course, a negative. I have a set of visuals that regrettably we cannot see, but major cities, cities that you also would know. It's not just about New York and London. There is Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, Hamburg, Nanjing. You have a whole bunch of major cities that have really become key actors in the global economy. It goes way beyond the famous cities. Now, I also had wanted to show you some slides about London, especially the center of London where the River Thames is, and you have an extraordinary mix of very powerful firms. It's worth, if you go to, many people go to London, it's not a bad idea to walk by that river and not just see it as, oh, pretty river, see it as the powerhouses that surround that dinner. that river, not that dinner. Yes, I'm thinking dinner. Now, the top 100 cities that have been evaluated by investment firms in terms of, their power, etc. So they account for 10% of the world's population. This, we're talking the top 100 cities by property investment. Those cities account for 10% of the world's population. That is huge. They account for 30% of the world's GDP. That is really huge. And guess what? 76% of property investment. In other words, there are 100 cities in the world that account for a very, very, very high share of property investment. This then also tells you that a lot of what happens in cities, and a lot of cities, lack most of what I just described to you, which holds for major cities, rich cities, cities that are, in good shape, so to say. Now, let me give you some figures. Worldwide, real estate assets are nearly 60% of the value of all global assets, including equities, bonds, and gold. Now, what we're talking about is something that in, say, if you take United States money, $217 trillion accounts for worldwide real estate assets and all those other things that have to do with assets and with housing. That is huge. That is just in case you hadn't understood that is a really big pile of money. I had some visuals that I wanted to show you about modes of building that are now privileged and that mark even more strongly the power of a city, or the class of a city. I want to finish with a list that is sort of an unusual. This was a very special study that the Financial Times did. The Financial Times is very smart publication. And they looked at something, at the making, if you want, of something that was called the super prime housing market. And that is a market where you and I and most of us have zero access to. It's a very special market, and the cities that it involves are also major cities. This is about great wealth, sort of an excess of wealth, if you want. And among them are Monaco, Paris, London, Dubai, New York City, Shanghai, Singapore, and just a few others. So there is now a limited, it's like a cabal almost, a limited number of cities that contain, number one, all kinds of things, including cleaners, etc. But number two, also contain very, very particular businesses, particular wealth owners, etc. And many of them are in Europe. The United States clearly is also part of it, but it is certainly very significant, and they have the power to shape those cities. They have the power almost to keep certain people out. Now, they of course need the cleaners, and they need all the low-wage workers as well. What they don't need are really most of the middle classes. What can the middle classes do for them, right? Not much. A bit, not much. So it's a very peculiar moment. I think this is a moment that is not going to last forever, but it is very, very particular. I had, again, some visuals that I wanted to show you about very crowded environments, urban environments, where there is simply not enough space for all the people who want to live there. They try to go vertical at great risk of buildings collapsing, etc. Now, why does all of this matter about cities? And it seems to me that one issue is that the city is one of the few spaces in today's world where those without power get to make a history, they get to make a culture, they get to make an economy, a modest economy. Right now, the rural areas are of enormous value, much more value than they used to be, and much more value on some level than most cities. Why? Because you can grow land, they are life sources that produce money, besides all the other things they generate. So the city has really become one of the few spaces in today's world where those without power get to make a history, a culture, an economy, even if they're small, even if they're little. There are moments, and I finish with this, this image, there are moments in the daily routines of a city when we're all urban subjects. It doesn't matter what we think of ourselves. It is a moment when the city can hack, this language of hacking, all the other more specific subjects. We also are grandmother, this, that, whatever it might be. And so that is absolutely a marvelous notion, that the rush in the morning and in the evening getting back home, we all, the rich and the not the super rich is another matter, but the high income classes, they are there cheek to cheek in the subways, with those who are the cleaners of their houses or of their offices. So one image again that I like, and I finish with this, I repeat some elements. There are moments in the daily routines of a city when we're all urban subjects, when the city can hack all the other more specific subjects we also are. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Hopefully we'll have audience members enter questions in the Q&A box for you. In the meantime, though, I just wanted to ask a question, if I may.
You may.
Your work presents an incredibly refreshing account of power. Rather than sort of taking the usual international relations account of power as based on nation states, you instead place the city at the forefront. And it's an amazing image of sort of these 70 global cities competing for investment by some 250,000 multinational corporations. And the extractive logics underlying that relationship are really clear from what you presented. I was wondering if you could say something about what you think determines whether cities become vehicles for inequality or vehicles for equality and inclusion. And you touched upon that a little when you talked about cities like Monaco, Dubai, Shanghai, where there's very little middle class, but you have the labor and the capital in a relationship. But you also said, well, culturally, there are things like public spaces that bring people together and transcend those logics. So what do cities need to be to promote equality and inclusion in the contemporary world?
Yeah, well, one move that you can see even in a city like New York or a city like London is to create public spaces. Our major cities have often suffered from not having public spaces. The Europeans have been far better because it's an old tradition. They started doing that, 100 years ago, and that was more difficult to destroy the trees and all of that. Whereas we have been rather more brutal. But I do think that enabling the city, so to say, literally urban space, to be able to receive graciously, this is an image, plants, dogs, people, spaces that are communal spaces. And so this image that I have is, let the space itself be the speech. Let the space itself be the one who says, this is our space, or it's your space, or whatever, some image like that. Now, some cities have been very good at that. there are other cities who have not been good at that. I will say that in many ways, the old American cities are not bad, you know, compared to some of the new types of cities where the rich areas are very well handled, but the poor areas, the poor people have almost nothing left. Now, and then you have countries like India with their enormous populations. I mean, it's a huge population where the poor have no space. They have no room. You cannot see my face, or can you see my face? Oh, you can. Oh, good. Are you the only one, or?
We can all see you, Saskia.
Very good. I like that. All right. Is there any question, or you want me to say more? Oh.
Susan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, Professor Sassen, I'd like to pick up on a point that you made where you think you were talking about the wealthier classes and their cleaners, and that they didn't really need the middle classes, or not much, you said. And you said you think that this is a moment of change. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about that. Like, what's the germ that's making this moment change? What has actually happened? I mean, germ was a bad choice with the virus, but you know what I mean? What is the thing that is going to propel this change?
Right. Well, I think that there are a few, like I like to think of it, new vectors in play. You know, a vector is a very partial element, but it can cut across all kinds of existing notions where we cannot cross. So to me, a vector is always an important live animal in the imagery. And it seems to me that the new generations, number one, are far less interested in having cars, you know, especially big cars. Like when you look at the United States story, especially, you know, in the 50s, I mean, the bigger the car, you know, the better. I mean, we are way past that. Many young people that I know, they want to have access to a car. They don't want to own a car. Owning a car is far too much a hassle. So you begin to see all of these little differences. Now, thinking of China, very different type of country. I've spent quite a bit of time in China. And enormous traffic, killer traffic. They confront a condition that is going to take them much more time to clean out a bit than, say, what we have in the West. Because in the West, there are now already so many people who do not want to own a car. My husband and I, we don't want to own a car. We want a service. Owning a car is a hassle. You know, you have to do all of these things. So I think that things are changing. And China, because it's such a new culture, they really believe in cars. A lot of people in the West are far more sort of wiser than that, in the sense that they know that, yeah, they need a car, but they don't need to own it. And owning comes, you know, with a hassle. We know that. And the typical neighborhoods in the United States, which you have all these cars parked, and the battle each night to get a parking spot. You know, I mean, people, the young generations are just not into that. And I think that is quite interesting, you know. I think that's good. There's much more to be said about the subject. But
Do you think, though, that might translate across to property that you were talking about, that future generations won't feel this need to own a house, that renting will suffice because then they can focus on other things? And do you think there's going to be any?
Well, we know that is beginning to happen, right? I mean, it started a while ago, actually, that younger people don't mind renting. The idea that you own your house, that's the proper citizens, you know, especially in the United States, that is quite strong. I think that is no longer so important to a lot of people. My husband and me, we don't want to own a car. There are so many good car services. You know, owning a car is a hassle. You have to take it for fixing, and you have to find the parking lots. I think there are more and more. This is a new generation also that sees it differently. I mean, if you're in a small town, a car probably is heaven. It's a gift of the gods to have a car. But not in our big cities. Not. Same thing in Europe. In Europe, you have all kinds of systems where you can, you know, step on a car and use it for a bit, and then you leave it again. And since trust is a bit of a stronger feature in Europe than, say, in the United States. It actually works. In the United States, it just often steal the, the whole thing, you know, which is not so pretty.
Thank you.
Starting to get a few questions come in from the audience. There's one here on class, and the audience member asks, not having middle classes in certain global cities, what could be examples of the kind of impact this has socially, culturally, and politically in the long term? And could you give us examples of cities that you think are well balanced in terms of social class, perhaps contrary to some of the global cities you mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think just on this last point, I think we have a lot of middle-sized cities, say, for instance, in the United States, but you can talk about any of the European countries, which are really reasonable propositions. You know, London is becoming less reasonable, though it still is more reasonable. It manages better, I would say, than New York City. I spent a lot of time in both cities. And London is, I think, more, it's a deeper intelligence, maybe a deeper history that has enabled it to keep more space for human interaction, you know, in terms both of living and of offices. It's different from Manhattan, I would say. Now, I think we, sooner or later, we're going to have to, in many cities, face to certain very difficult moves. And one of them has to do with car use. You know, cars they take a lot of space. And as we see, you know, let's remember that a lot of what used to be fields, etc., no longer exists, where you could have built. And more and more people now are confined, almost, you could say, to living in the major city, especially when in big cities, you see a lot of people living in those cities who you could think, well, why aren't they living in some, you know, smaller town, etc., but they can because of jobs. So I don't know where it goes next, but right now I would say it is not such a great period. And I'm not just thinking because of the virus and all of that. I'm thinking really that what it means to be a city is changing. And this is a meaning that has changed, you know, across the centuries. Let's remember that we had cities long before we had countries or nations and whatever. Cities have always been there, and they have survived the greatest variety of regimes and wars and I don't know what all. So the cities are going to stay here. I think the question is really, will nation states remain as significant as they are? And that's a question that you rarely hear people ask. You know, they assume that a nation state is a nation state. Okay, fine. But what will be their significance? You know, we have a lot of states, yeah, they are nation states, and they don't have strong standing in the world, etc., etc. And I think we are going to see more of that in terms of the national state apparatus. So in London, in New York, in you know, in London, these big cities, what is adorable are some of the cities, you know, and that is what counts, etc. That is what is alive. Yes, we need fields to grow food and we need all of that. But I have the sense that cities will survive. Will national states survive under the conditions that they exist on today? I think that is where we're going to see the difference. And, you know, when you take a country like the United States, which has huge countries in it, I mean, the big cities are what counts. It's Chicago, it's San Francisco, and then the rest is like we need it economically, etc. You know, but it's quite interesting to me that there will be, I think, options that will escape being this almost invisible place in a huge country like the United States.
Thank you. Adam has asked the question, which I think is quite nicely links. He's said, you focused on major cities, London, New York, Singapore, and the specificities of these cities in global circuits. What constitutes a major city, and what can be said of minor cities in inner city geographies, global circuits, and power?
Well, we have to be aware. I have made a big deal out of this particular element, which is that a lot of small cities or cities that are not well known or actually play critical roles in maintaining and supporting the existence of the big, famous, well-known cities. Detroit lost all its grandeur, right? It all left for New York and for whatever, the West Coast. But there are elements that we need. We need them. We cannot afford to lose them. And there was a particular moment, when there was a time when the United States went through quite a few transformations. And in that period, suddenly it became evident that certain elements were gone, they were lacking, and they were needed in the city. And that then also revived the whole notion of smaller cities, etc. So that's one little element. The other little element is families who want, yes, they want a city, but they want to live at the edges of a city, where it's nice, there's green, it's reasonable, blah, blah. So you have sort of a multiplication of engagements with the urban, but they go through special paths. It's not everything about the city. It's not the enamorment that we all had in the early 1900s. I wasn't alive then, but I gather there was. The city was like the beating heart for the intellectuals, for the this, for the that. We're over that mostly, I would say. And so the city is there. It's like a reassuring condition, because really that's how we can eat, drink, have parties. The city is a very important, generous soul in its own way, And so we would notice it if cities were no longer there. We would really notice it. So anyhow, this is all very familiar stuff. So I could go on and on, because I love this subject.
We've got another question, which is, I think, a very contemporary challenge in politics across a whole series of liberal democratic states. And the question is, urban dwellers tend to vote more for liberal political parties as compared to more conservative rural dwellers. Can you comment on how political power dynamics between rural and urban areas are likely to develop in the future? And I mean, to add to that, you can think about the geography of voting patterns, whether it's in US presidential elections, whether it's in the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom,
right,
whether it's in Germany. The urban-rural divide, as it's become known, is one of the fault lines of contemporary politics. How do you see that emerging and evolving over time?
I think it is changing. And there are two vectors in play, it seems to me, to give it a very quick. One of them is how the businesses are distributing themselves, that it's no longer just a few cities very highly concentrated. You now have a growing set of cities that are, that are serious parts of the economy. They're not just housing for people. That's one thing. And our big cities, like the New Yorks, etc., are also, I think, changing in the sense that they don't want to keep expanding. There is a sense of measure. The old Greeks had this wonderful phrase, sophrosune, that with measure, things with measure. Now, I think LA would have a very hard time doing it with measure, because it is so widespread. I'm just talking about the spread, right? But I think we're going in that direction, that we will have more and more bigger cities, but they are not like the super, super big cities. Where you have the super big cities is often in the global south. Once a city is there, you accumulate. And to me, my reading includes, among the key reasons for that the high level businesses and the wealthier people, I mean, I'm talking about a 30%, not a 10%, they like to have access to all of that. They don't suffer. They are living in the center. So to them, it is an invisible mode of suffering that workers have to travel for an hour and a half to get to their jobs, in crowded, etc. So I think that sooner or later we are going to have to remedy that, because it is simply becoming unacceptable. And the new generations, the young people, also find that absolutely horrendous. Whereas the older people, it seems like they haven't even thought about that. You know, they know it exists. Okay, fine. They don't, you know. So I think we will see. I always say we have to make new cities, and that sounds very strange. When I say that to my students, one reaction often is, every year, because I try it out on them every year, is but we have done that. In other words, from their perspective, we have all the cities we need, and that's it. It's finished. It's accomplished. It's done. And of course not. But you know, you can just tell that they hadn't even thought about the notion building a city. Because this is major, but I think that is what we're up to. I mean, there are countries like China who are doing that to an extent that is frightening. You know, building new cities. They just prop down these new cities all over. That is an extreme case. But you know, the West and Europe is, of course, a very good example. Europe has a lot of cities that are reasonable. They are not, you know, these huge cities that we have produced in the Americas. Is that an answer, or do I? Okay.
So one interesting question that's come up in the chat is, would you call Las Vegas a successful model for a city?
I would call Las Vegas quite an innovative and daring concept with limited outcomes, but the outcomes that it has clearly matter a lot to those people who like Las Vegas or whatever these other places, right? So it is a kind of formation, if you want, that you have to stand back and to say, wow, that worked. You know, it is sort of funny. I mean, I would not want to live there, but I think a lot of people actually like living there. And this is something else, you know, that we have to accept, that there are really different tastes. But my thing right now is that, you know, a city like New York, a city like London, they're too big. They should really, you know, stop expanding their ground. And they're doing that, by the way, but there are new cities that are not, that are in full flow of expansion. I think that's a mistake, because the ones who pay the price are the more modest classes. The rich, you know, they're fine anywhere. But not the lower income and the modest middle classes, and they're serious people, you know, they want to do it all right. They get to pay a very high price for the luxuries and the pleasures of the rich in those cities, because those rich people keep buying the central area up, etc. And so those modest middle classes have long trips to work. I don't think that's right. I have no power to change that, however. Zero. But you know, I think that it is emerging as an element.
I have a final question for you that links closely to one of the questions in the chat. And it really gets to the heart of what we're trying to explore in the start of this series. And it's, how do you think about power? What does the concept of power mean to you? And where else does it lie other than in big cities and big businesses?
Well, you know, power is the main concept, right? Well, power is a very ambiguous term. Number one, you know, we have good power, we have bad power. Electricity is power, you know, etc. Being able to kill your enemy is a kind of power in many situations, you know. So it is a tough one. And so one question is whether we have to find other language. What is a city? You know, saying, oh, it's a city is no longer enough. You know, and I begin to argue, I didn't get to talk about that because without my slides, it would have become very difficult to explain. But I think there are certain places that think of themselves as a city. And I argue, you know what? They are not cities. They are just agglomerations. Let's keep the concept of the city for something that is a bit more substantive than just, you know, a big concentration of buildings. A big concentration of buildings should not automatically be thought of as a city. You know, and so I argue that cities should really try to produce certain, you know, certain spaces that require enormous, well, those modes of production that require vast sizes should not be happening in cities, because it de-urbanizes actually. So one of my things now, well, I've been doing that for a while, is, you know, what are the elements that we can detect that have the effect of de-urbanizing what still looks like a city? Because you have the buildings, you have the this, you have the that, right? And so the in a way, it means really being a bit tough on what really is a city. Not every, you know, set of constructed housing and a few restaurants is a city. And the West Coast is, of course, fascinating, because they have, the West Coast in the United States, because they have sort of shaped, I mean, LA is, I like LA, by the way, a lot of people like LA, but LA is that new type of city. I mean, less so now than it used to be, but very different from San Francisco. I prefer LA to San Francisco, and some of my friends are horrified at that notion. But I really think that LA is alive and severely incomplete, whereas San Francisco, yes, it is also alive, but it is done. It's done. And that, you know, yeah. So, are we done?
I think we are on that note. It'll be interesting to see if we get any emails about San Francisco being done. Professor
All right. I mean, no, the San Francisco crowd, because San Francisco is impressive. I mean, it's an impressive city, and it is almost not a sort of American city. You know, it's a different kind of city. But I must confess, I spent time in both, and I found LA. More also LA at that time, at least, you know, LA had these invisible spaces where young artists, I was a young person at that point, would just have the most amazing sort of experiences and interventions, you know, because it was an unfinished city. It had empty spaces, you know, but that goes back quite a while. So I really liked LA. Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much, Professor Sassen, for kicking off our Hillary term lecture series for Oxford Minds. It's been absolutely brilliant, and a really good lecture for our panel to follow up with next week. Alex, do you want to?
Let me just add my thanks and say, I mean, it's this year, I think, is the 20th anniversary of you publishing The Global City. And yet hearing you talk about this, it still seems fresh, radical, innovative, and as relevant to the contemporary world as it was then. And I think seeing that sort of 20-year period, it is remarkable that you're still giving us a different and fresh take on what power is, and slicing the world up differently from the usual Westphalian nation-state approach. So thank you very much for sharing with us, our faculty colleagues, our students. We're really grateful for your time.
Well, it was a pleasure, really a pleasure. À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
Bye-bye. Good night.